Before we begin, take a moment to support the channel. Subscribe and like the video. It really helps us share real history and bring important stories like this to more people. The world. After the First World War, broken empires and fragile peace. When the First World War ended in November 1918, the world stood at a historical crossroads. The conflict had reshaped not only borders and governments, but also the psychological foundations of entire societies. What many hoped would be the war to end all wars instead became the opening chapter of a far more destructive global catastrophe. To understand how the Second World War became possible, it is essential to examine the unstable world that emerged from the ruins of the first global conflict. A continent in ruins, Europe in 1918 was devastated. Entire cities lay in ruins, transportation networks were shattered, and industrial production had collapsed in many regions. Millions of soldiers returned home physically wounded or psychologically scarred, often to societies unable to support or reintegrate them. Civilian populations, having endured years of shortages, bombardments, and loss, faced poverty and uncertainty rather than relief. The human cost was staggering. An entire generation had been lost or traumatized, leaving deep demographic and social imbalances. Families were broken, labor forces weakened, and trust in political leadership severely damaged. The war had demonstrated that modern industrial societies were capable of destruction on an unprecedented scale, and this realization haunted the post-war world. The collapse of empires. One of the most dramatic consequences of the war was the collapse of long-standing empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire disintegrated into a collection of new states. The Ottoman Empire lost most of its territories and ceased to exist as a major power. The Russian Empire collapsed amid revolution and civil war, giving rise to a radically new political system. Even the German Empire fell, replaced by a fragile republic. These collapses created vast political vacuums. New nations emerged almost overnight, many without stable institutions, clear borders, or shared national identities. While independence was celebrated, it also brought immediate challenges. Ethnic minorities often found themselves trapped within new borders, governed by states that viewed them with suspicion or hostility. The promise of national self-determination, though inspiring in theory, proved extremely difficult to implement in practice. The peace settlements. In 1919, the victorious powers gathered to reshape the world and prevent future wars. The resulting agreements, especially the Treaty of Versailles, were intended to establish a new international order. However, the process was deeply flawed from the beginning. The treaties were largely dictated by the victors, leaving the defeated nations with little voice in decisions that would define their futures. Germany, in particular, was subjected to severe territorial losses, military restrictions, and economic obligations. Many Germans perceived these terms not as justice but as collective punishment. This sense of humiliation became a powerful force in shaping political attitudes during the interwar period. Other peace agreements redrew borders across Central and Eastern Europe with limited understanding of local conditions. Regions with mixed populations were assigned to new states, creating internal tensions that would persist for decades. Rather than resolving conflicts, the treaties often froze them in place, postponing confrontation rather than eliminating it. The idealism and limits of new institutions. Alongside the peace treaties came an ambitious attempt to prevent future conflict through international cooperation. The League of Nations was established as a forum where disputes could be resolved peacefully and collective security could be maintained. Its creation reflected a widespread desire to avoid another global disaster. The League, however, suffered from serious weaknesses. It lacked its own military force and depended on the willingness of member states to enforce its decisions. Major powers disagreed on how it should function, and some key nations either never joined or later withdrew. As a result, the League often appeared more symbolic than effective. The vision behind the League was heavily influenced by the ideas of Woodrow Wilson, who believed that diplomacy, transparency, and cooperation could replace secret alliances and power politics. While these ideals resonated with war-weary populations, they struggled to survive in a world still driven by national interests and unresolved grievances. Economic aftershocks. The economic consequences of the First World War were profound and long-lasting. Wartime borrowing had left many governments deeply in debt, and international trade networks had been severely disrupted. Recovery required cooperation and stability, yet the post-war environment offered neither in sufficient measure. Reparations, especially those imposed on Germany, became a central source of tension. Payments were difficult to sustain and contributed to economic instability both within Germany and across Europe. Inflation, unemployment, and social unrest followed, undermining confidence in governments and democratic institutions. Economic hardship was not limited to defeated nations. Even victorious countries faced enormous challenges, including demobilization, reintegration of soldiers, and reconstruction. The global economy remained fragile, vulnerable to shocks that would later prove catastrophic. Social and psychological consequences. Beyond material destruction, the war left deep psychological scars. Trust in traditional authority figures, politicians, generals, and even intellectuals, was severely weakened. Many people felt betrayed by leaders who had promised quick victories but delivered years of slaughter instead. This disillusionment created fertile ground for radical ideas. Some sought revolutionary change, believing that the existing system had failed completely. Others longed for order, discipline, and strong leadership to restore a sense of meaning and security. These opposing impulses would shape political movements throughout the interwar years. The memory of the war also influenced how societies viewed future conflict. While many embraced pacifism, determined to avoid another catastrophe, others concluded that strength and preparedness were the only guarantees of survival. This contradiction lay at the heart of interwar politics. A peace built on unstable foundations. By the early 1920s, it was clear that the post-war settlement had created a fragile peace at best. The new international order depended on cooperation, economic recovery, and political moderation, conditions that were difficult to sustain in a world marked by resentment, fear, and uncertainty. The First World War had ended, but its legacy continued to shape global affairs in destructive ways. Unresolved disputes, economic instability, and psychological trauma combined to weaken the foundations of peace. The world had not truly recovered. It had merely paused, catching its breath before the next even greater storm. Economic collapse and social trauma. A world in crisis. The fragile peace that followed the First World War was deeply dependent on economic recovery. Without stability, employment, and a sense of future security, political reconciliation and international cooperation were unlikely to succeed. Yet the global economy of the interwar years was weak, unbalanced, and vulnerable to sudden shocks. When those shocks arrived, they accelerated social trauma and pushed entire societies toward desperation, radicalization, and fear. An unstable economic recovery. In the early 1920s, many governments hoped that economic growth would heal the wounds of war. Factories were rebuilt, trade routes slowly reopened, and currencies were stabilized in some regions. However, this recovery was uneven and fragile. Some countries experienced short periods of growth, while others struggled with chronic unemployment and inflation. Germany, burdened by reparations and internal political conflict, faced severe financial instability. Hyperinflation destroyed savings and wiped out the middle class, leaving millions economically and emotionally devastated. Although stabilization efforts later brought temporary relief, the damage to social trust and political confidence had already been done. Elsewhere in Europe, war debts and reconstruction costs strained national budgets. Governments borrowed heavily, often relying on international loans to sustain basic functions. This created a complex and risky financial system in which the economic health of one nation depended on the stability of many others. The global financial system and hidden vulnerabilities. The post-war global economy was interconnected but poorly coordinated. International trade depended on credit, and credit depended on confidence. The United States emerged as a major economic power, providing loans that supported European recovery. While this system allowed for short-term growth, it was inherently unstable. Economic relationships were built on fragile assumptions. If loans were withdrawn or trade disrupted, entire economies could collapse. Few policymakers fully understood the scale of this risk. Instead, many believed that markets would regulate themselves and that prosperity would continue indefinitely. This illusion of stability masked deep structural weaknesses. Industrial production often outpaced consumer demand, leading to overproduction. Agricultural prices collapsed, harming rural communities and increasing inequality. Wealth became concentrated, while millions struggled to survive. The Great Economic Collapse. When the global financial system finally broke down at the end of the 1920s, the consequences were immediate and devastating. Banks failed, businesses closed, and unemployment soared across continents. What began as a financial crisis quickly became a social and political catastrophe. Families lost homes, savings, and dignity. Breadlines and makeshift shelters became common sights in major cities. For many, the promise of progress and prosperity that had followed the war turned into bitterness and despair. The sense that the existing economic and political system had failed became widespread. Governments were overwhelmed. Traditional economic policies proved ineffective, and leaders struggled to offer solutions. As suffering deepened, public patience wore thin. Democratic institutions, already weakened by years of instability, faced growing hostility from citizens who saw them as incapable of protecting society. Social trauma and the loss of trust. Economic collapse did more than destroy livelihoods. It shattered trust. People lost faith in banks, governments, and international cooperation. The belief that rules and agreements could ensure stability was replaced by a sense of permanent insecurity. Social divisions intensified. Workers blamed employers, citizens blamed politicians, and nations blamed each other. Extremist groups exploited these tensions, presenting themselves as the only forces capable of decisive action. Simplistic explanations and promises of rapid recovery gained appeal in a world desperate for hope. The middle class, traditionally a stabilizing force in many societies, was particularly affected. As savings disappeared and social status declined, many felt betrayed by systems they had once supported. This group would later play a crucial role in the political transformations of the 1930s. Radical solutions in desperate times. Economic desperation made radical ideas appear practical rather than dangerous. Movements that rejected compromise and promoted absolute solutions gained momentum. These groups framed politics as a struggle between enemies and portrayed themselves as defenders of the nation against internal and external threats. In Germany, economic collapse significantly contributed to the rise of Adolf Hitler. By promising employment, national revival, and strong leadership, his movement attracted support from a wide range of social groups. The crisis allowed extremist narratives to overshadow moderate voices. Similar patterns emerged elsewhere. In many countries, political debate became increasingly polarized. Trust in democratic procedures declined as citizens demanded immediate action rather than lengthy discussion. Emergency measures and centralized authority were increasingly accepted as necessary responses to crisis. The psychological weight of uncertainty. Living through prolonged economic hardship had profound psychological effects. Fear of unemployment, hunger, and social collapse became constant companions. Planning for the future seemed impossible when survival was uncertain. This atmosphere of anxiety changed how societies viewed authority. Strong leadership and clear direction became attractive, even if they required sacrifices in personal freedom. Stability, order, and predictability were valued more than pluralism or debate. The experience of economic collapse also reshaped attitudes toward conflict. For some, war began to seem less terrifying than continued poverty and humiliation. The memory of hardship made populations more willing to accept the idea of confrontation if it promised national renewal. Economic crisis as a turning point. The global economic crisis of the interwar years marked a decisive turning point. It exposed the weaknesses of the post-war settlement and accelerated the breakdown of international cooperation. Instead of uniting nations in collective recovery, the crisis encouraged competition, protectionism, and isolation. Trade barriers rose, currencies were manipulated, and nations prioritized their own survival over global stability. These actions deepened the crisis and increased hostility between states. Economic conflict became a precursor to political and military confrontation. By the early 1930s, it was clear that the world was moving away from cooperation and toward confrontation. The economic foundations of peace had collapsed, leaving societies traumatized and vulnerable to radical change. A society prepared for extremes. Economic collapse and social trauma prepared societies psychologically for the dramatic transformations that followed. Fear, anger, and humiliation created an environment in which extreme solutions seemed reasonable. The crisis did not cause war directly, but it removed many of the barriers that might have prevented it. As economic suffering continued, the appeal of nationalism, militarism, and authoritarian leadership grew stronger. The world was no longer merely unstable. It was searching desperately for certainty, even if that certainty came at a terrible cost. The rise of authoritarian ideologies and political radicalization. By the early 1930s, the political landscape of many countries had changed dramatically. Economic collapse, social trauma, and the failure of traditional institutions created an environment in which extreme ideologies could flourish. Democracy, still relatively new in many states, appeared weak and ineffective. In contrast, authoritarian movements presented themselves as disciplined, decisive, and capable of restoring national strength. This shift marked a crucial stage in the path toward the Second World War. The crisis of democracy. In the aftermath of the First World War, numerous countries adopted democratic constitutions. These systems were built on ideals of representation, compromise, and rule of law. However, democracy requires stability, trust, and time to mature, conditions largely absent in the interwar years. Parliamentary governments struggled to respond quickly to economic crises and social unrest. Coalition governments often collapsed under internal disagreements, reinforcing the perception of chaos and incompetence. For ordinary citizens facing unemployment and insecurity, political debate seemed disconnected from reality. As frustration grew, confidence in democratic institutions declined. This disillusionment was particularly strong in societies where democracy was associated with national defeat or humiliation. In such contexts, democratic leaders were blamed for weakness, while authoritarian figures were praised for promising strength and unity. Ideology as a source of certainty. Authoritarian ideologies offered simple explanations for complex problems. They identified clear enemies, promoted national rebirth, and promised decisive action. In a world marked by fear and uncertainty, these narratives provided psychological comfort. National identity became the core of political life. Individual interests were subordinated to the perceived needs of the state, and loyalty was framed as a moral duty. Opposition and dissent were portrayed not as legitimate differences of opinion but as threats to national survival. These ideologies rejected compromise, viewing politics as a struggle rather than a dialogue. This mindset justified the use of force, censorship, and repression as necessary tools for preserving unity and order. Germany and the path to radicalization. Germany offers one of the clearest examples of how authoritarian ideology gained dominance. The combination of economic crisis, political fragmentation, and resentment over the post-war settlement created ideal conditions for radical movements. The National Socialist movement, led by Adolf Hitler, exploited these conditions with remarkable effectiveness. By blending nationalism, social promises, and powerful symbolism, the movement attracted widespread support. It presented itself as both revolutionary and restorative, promising to transform society while reclaiming a glorified national past. Once in power, the regime moved swiftly to dismantle democratic institutions. Political parties were eliminated, independent media suppressed, and opposition silenced. The state expanded its control over education, culture, and daily life, ensuring that ideology permeated every level of society. Authoritarianism. Beyond Germany, Germany was not alone in this transformation. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already established an authoritarian system based on centralized power, nationalism, and expansionist ambitions. His regime emphasized discipline, obedience, and the revival of historical grandeur. In Japan, political power increasingly shifted toward military leaders who argued that territorial expansion was essential for economic survival. Civilian institutions weakened as the military asserted greater influence over government decisions. National destiny was framed in terms of strength, sacrifice, and regional dominance. Across Eastern Europe, several states abandoned democratic governance in favor of authoritarian rule. While each regime had unique characteristics, they shared common features: suppression of dissent, concentration of power, and emphasis on national unity over individual rights. Propaganda and the control of perception. A defining feature of authoritarian regimes was their mastery of propaganda. Modern communication tools, radio, film, newspapers, and mass rallies were used to shape public perception and reinforce ideological messages. Propaganda did more than promote leaders. It created emotional narratives that connected personal hardship to national struggle. Citizens were encouraged to see themselves as part of a collective mission, united by shared destiny and common enemies. Successes were exaggerated, failures concealed, and alternative viewpoints eliminated. Over time, this constant exposure reshaped how people understood reality. Loyalty to the state became synonymous with morality, while skepticism was framed as betrayal. The line between belief and coercion grew increasingly blurred. The role of youth and education systems were transformed into instruments of ideological training. Curricula emphasized national history, sacrifice, and obedience. Critical thinking was discouraged, replaced by memorization of approved narratives and symbols. Youth organizations played a particularly important role. They offered a sense of belonging, purpose, and adventure at a time when traditional social structures were weakening. Physical training, discipline, and ideological instruction prepared young people to serve the state unquestioningly. By shaping attitudes from an early age, authoritarian regimes ensured long-term loyalty and reduced the likelihood of internal resistance. A generation grew up viewing militarism and obedience as normal aspects of life. The normalization of repression. As authoritarian systems consolidated power, repression became normalized. Surveillance, censorship, and political persecution were justified as necessary measures to protect society. Legal systems were reshaped to serve the state rather than individual rights. Many citizens accepted these changes, believing that security and stability required sacrifice. Others remained silent out of fear or resignation. Over time, the absence of open opposition reinforced the illusion of widespread support. This environment discouraged critical reflection and moral responsibility. Decisions were framed as orders, and responsibility was shifted upward to leadership. Such conditions made it easier for societies to accept increasingly aggressive policies without widespread resistance. Ideological conflict and international tension. The rise of authoritarian ideologies intensified international tensions. These regimes viewed the world as a competitive arena in which survival depended on strength and expansion. Diplomatic compromise was seen as weakness, and international agreements were treated as temporary obstacles rather than binding commitments. Ideological hostility toward neighboring states and perceived enemies fueled aggressive foreign policies. Military power became both a tool and a symbol of national rebirth. Rearmament accelerated, and the language of conflict became increasingly common in public discourse. By the mid-1930s, the ideological foundations of peace had eroded. The world was no longer divided simply by borders, but by fundamentally different visions of political order and human society. A world moving toward confrontation. The rise of authoritarian ideologies marked a decisive step toward war. Economic hardship had created the conditions, but ideology provided direction and justification. Societies were no longer merely unstable, they were being actively prepared for confrontation. Authoritarian regimes promised certainty in an uncertain world, but their vision required expansion, control, and conflict. As these ideas took root, the possibility of peaceful coexistence diminished. The path to war was no longer abstract. It was being paved through daily policies, education, and propaganda. Diplomatic failure, the final road to war, and the collapse of peace. By the late 1930s, the international system designed to preserve peace was effectively broken. Diplomatic institutions still existed, but their authority had eroded. Agreements were signed, conferences were held, and speeches were delivered, yet none of these actions addressed the underlying realities of power, fear, and ambition. The world was moving toward war not because diplomacy disappeared, but because it no longer carried real consequences. The illusion of appeasement. Western powers, still traumatized by the memory of the First World War, were determined to avoid another large-scale conflict. This desire shaped a policy later known as appeasement, an approach based on the belief that reasonable concessions could satisfy aggressive states and preserve peace. Leaders, such as Neville Chamberlain, believed that stability could be maintained through negotiation and compromise. Agreements were presented to the public as victories for peace, reinforcing the hope that war could still be avoided. However, these concessions sent a different message to authoritarian regimes, that expansion would not be met with decisive resistance. Each diplomatic retreat weakened the credibility of collective security. Treaties lost their meaning, and international law became flexible rather than binding. Instead of reducing tension, appeasement encouraged further demands. The breakdown of collective security. The failure of international cooperation became increasingly clear. The League of Nations, intended to enforce peace, proved incapable of acting decisively. Without unified military or political backing, its resolutions were ignored. Nations began prioritizing national survival over shared responsibility. Alliances shifted, trust disappeared, and diplomacy became reactive rather than preventative. Decisions were driven by short-term calculations rather than long-term stability. As cooperation collapsed, isolation and suspicion replaced dialogue. The mechanisms designed to stop conflict were still in place, but they no longer functioned. The final steps toward war. By 1939, the remaining barriers to war were psychological rather than structural. Military preparations were complete, societies were conditioned for conflict, and political leaders framed war as unavoidable. Diplomatic agreements made during this period were tactical rather than sincere. They were used to gain time, reposition forces, or confuse opponents. Peace was no longer the goal. Advantage was. When open conflict finally began, it did not shock the world. It confirmed what many had already sensed. Years of warnings, ignored signals, and failed compromises had led to this moment. Conclusion: how peace quietly died. The Second World War did not begin with a single decision or a sudden act. It emerged from years of hesitation, fear, and miscalculation. Economic collapse weakened societies. Authoritarian ideologies reshaped values, militarization normalized violence, and diplomacy lost its authority. Peace did not end abruptly. It eroded slowly. Each ignored violation, each broken promise, and each failed response made the next step toward war easier. By the time the conflict began, the world had already accepted it as inevitable. The lesson of this period is not only historical. It shows how fragile peace can be when fear outweighs responsibility and when short-term stability is valued over long-term justice. Wars do not begin on battlefields alone. They begin when societies stop believing that peace is worth defending.